This is a Global Cal-Link prepaid call from
Bryn Wolf.
an inmate at
Amador Valley High School.
From This American Life in WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm not Sarah Koenig. In fact, none of us are, but more on that later.
Have you ever read a book or watched a movie that was so cleverly written you didn't even realize it until it ended? You know, those kinds of stories where there's only about 15 minutes left and you're thinking, there's no freaking way they can resolve this by the end. Then somehow they do, and all the pieces of the puzzle come together.
This is not that. Welcome to episode 849,873,457,238,948 of Serial, where today we'll be looking at the Adnan Syed case.
Again? Really? Jesus Christ.
Okay, so we're going into this whole thing assuming anyone listening has already listened to Serial with an S. If you haven't, pause this, get up, and go listen to Serial, with an S that is. While you're there, have a look at the podcast website for more information, take notes like you're a detective, and form some of your own opinions. Okay, now let's get started. Do you think that Adnan killed Hay?
Do I? No.
No?
I don't know. I guess. Yes. Do you?
Absolutely not.
No.
Do you think that the police fed Jay his story?
Yes.
Oh yeah, definitely.
For sure. The majority of it, at least.
I wouldn't say like 100%, but they definitely helped craft like a more like fluid timeline for him.
Yes!
Do you think Adnan should get another trial?
Yes.
I think so, yes.
No.
No, why?
I feel like there's not going to be any new evidence. It's been so long that there's not going to be anything that'll change the verdict.
Yeah, for sure. Not even if he probably did it, the trial was so terribly done that he just he deserves the right to a fair trial.
Honestly, no. I feel like he's had his chance.
No.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
No,
leave the poor man alone.
I like how I think he just
Did you notice anything strange about those interviews? Not strange per se, as it seems to be fairly normal when it comes to discussing the murder of Hae Min Lee. Did you notice anything a bit off about the interviews? Keep in mind, every single person who you just heard has listened to the entirety of Season 1 of Serial, with an S, and watched the HBO docuseries, The Case Against Adnan Syed. They all have the same information.
Nothing? You didn't notice anything out of place? You didn't notice anything that doesn't add up? Let's have another look at our interviews. Do you think that Adnan killed Hay?
Do I? No.
No?
I don't know. I guess. Yes. Do you?
Absolutely not.
No. I think Jay killed Hay.
Nobody can agree on who killed Hae Min Lee. This is why Serial, with an S, was flawed. Well, it's not the only reason. We could spend the next 20 minutes discussing how terrible Sarah Koenig's investigative reporting was, but that's a conversation for another time. Too much time was spent on the how, the why, the who. At the end of the day, no one will ever know what really happened to Hae Min Lee at 2:36 p.m. on January 13th, 1999. As sad as that is, it's happened.
It's over. There's no going back. No one but the killer knows who committed the crime. All that's left to do is accept that and move forward.
But moving forward doesn't mean we have to leave this case behind. Let's ask a new question. What's next for Adnan Syed?
One road to freedom that has been explored by Adnan's defense lies beneath our victim's fingernail. DNA evidence. Samples were taken from Hayes' fingernails from clothing and in her car, none of which matched Adnan's DNA when tested. Not only was the DNA and the fingerprints not Adnan's, but they did not match anyone currently in the database, meaning the true killer either has not been convicted or was convicted before regular DNA sampling. During arrest became common practice in Baltimore County.
Unfortunately, that's all we know for sure. To explore the scientific technicalities of DNA evidence, we spoke with Maria White, a biotechnology and biology teacher at Amador Valley High School. First of all, because this case, it happened 20 years ago, what do you think the chances are that any new evidence could be found, and how common is it for DNA to be tested this far after a trial like that?
So it has happened quite a bit where they've actually tested stored samples of things decades later. The problem is that whatever the sample is that contained the DNA may not have viable or enough DNA to be able to go through the PCR or the replication process to be able to then do DNA sequencing. There have been some cases where they have done that. The cases where they've done that tended to be, though, rape situations where there was a lot of DNA that had been left behind and it didn't break down over that amount of time. So it's possible. Is it going to be successful? Possibly not.
Yeah.
So it just depends on the evidence itself.
So if they were to be able to find DNA that they didn't pull earlier and test it, can you explain a little bit about how, what the system means? Because they talked about that in the podcast a little.
Yeah, so we have a national DNA database as well as state databases. And the databases are originally people who've been convicted of a felony. And then over time, it's changed to people who have been arrested. So even if you never ended up getting convicted, your DNA is most likely in the system. And each lab can choose to share their information into the national database or keep it at a state level. And that's dictated by the state, so I'm not sure specifically what Maryland would do with that. Mm-hmm. But at this point, only those that have been arrested and or convicted would be in the system. So if he has no prior conviction, there's nothing for him to hit against unless they were to compare his current sample with the one that would be on record. The other issue is there's a lot of backlogged samples of DNA that we just don't have the money to run, which is a really sad situation why a lot of people are waiting in jail for a long time, and it costs a lot of money to have labs run it.
I remember in biotech when we did the forensics unit, we talked a lot about the reliability of eyewitness testimonies. The state prosecutor's entire case was built on this guy named Jay Wilds. He didn't witness the murder, but he saw Adnan have Hay in the trunk of the car, and he goes back and forth on whether or not he helped him bury her. Do you think it was right for the jury to weigh his testimony that much?
So eyewitness testimony is extremely unreliable. There's a group called the Innocence Project, which goes through and helps try to overturn convictions. I think their data said something like 75% of the convictions that have been overturned with DNA they originally put in jail because of eyewitness testimony. So we know our ability to create memories is dictated by the circumstances around when those memories are created, and so it would not be a good thing to convict someone solely on eyewitness testimony.
So if they were to find some new DNA in court, be held higher than
it should. It definitely should. So eyewitness alone is not enough to typically dictate something like a murder charge. It normally gets thrown out, and so the fact that it's gone to that level seems really interesting. Any other proof would then either corroborate it or at least hopefully set him free if he didn't end up doing it.
So, that's what new DNA evidence could do for Adnan in the future. Corroborate Jay's story, or set Adnan free. Maybe. As of right now, this is all hypothetical. But what if it wasn't?
The first time Adnan went to court, the judge declared a mistrial due to an issue between Gutierrez and the judge that was overheard by the jury. The second time around, the jury found Adnan guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. This was in February of 2000.
For the next 15 years, Adnan and his legal team has made multiple attempts to get a new trial because Gutierrez never investigated Asia McClain as a viable alibi witness. In 2016, the Baltimore City Circuit Court granted their request for a new trial but denied bail, and in 2018, the Maryland Court of Special Appeals upheld this decision.
However, on March 8, 2019, the Maryland Court of Appeals voted 4-3 to reverse the lower appellate court's ruling, effectively denying the new trial. Right now, Adnan Syed remains incarcerated at Maryland Correctional Facility.
So, is there any hope for Adnan? What is his best case scenario? We asked Samuel Weaver, AP U.S. Government and Politics teacher at Amador Valley High School, the end-all be-all resource when it comes to the judicial system. So unlike some of the other people we are interviewing, you have actually listened to Serial.
Yes.
With an S, that is. What is your opinion on the case?
My opinion on the case is I believe there is enough reasonable doubt that the jury should have found him not guilty. That's kind of how our system works. Is it always the fairest system? Not necessarily. Does it mean they found the murderer? No, but it's not about finding the murderer, it's about finding the right murderer. And if there is enough doubt, then the jury should find suspects not guilty. We do have this problem in our system of people wanting to find the murderer. We have to rectify that with what true, real justice is. It's a tough lesson for us. I don't think we'll ever get there, but slowly and surely, hopefully we do. I still think our system is one of the better systems in the world. Is it always the best? No, but it's better than what else is out there.
So at this point, is there any hope for Adnan? What could happen with his case?
Of course, you can always appeal to the Supreme Court. That's kind of how the Supreme Court functions as a final court of appeals and can check state Supreme Courts. I would imagine that they would appeal that decision to the state Supreme Court, especially since you have issues of due process involved and 14th Amendment issues, states have to comply with that. So I'd imagine they would appeal. Whether or not, one, the court takes the case, and two, rules in his favor, it remains to be seen. But there is that possibility. I don't think it's dead in the water yet.
What do you think that his chances are that they would hear it?
Well, there's the Rule 4. Rule 4 says that 4 justices must agree to hear the case. It's hard to say because you would need to have an understanding of which justices have an interest in this case in terms of their background with criminal due process, or if it is too high profile and it's not something that is a substantial matter, they might choose not to take the case. There's nothing that compels them to take a case like this. The court really tries to focus on the justiciability of it, right? How much of this is an actual constitutional issue. And since it does sound like there is grounds for constitutional issues based on the lower court's rulings, they might be willing to take that case. They could still side against him based on the arguments presented by the state of Maryland and by his own private attorneys.
So, just as Robbie has said in Serial with an S, it looks like Adnan's only choice is to try to go to the Supreme Court. As for how that case might turn out, we thought we'd ask some people who actually went to law school.
So far, we've discussed different options the defense has when moving forward with Adnan's case. We know they could work in theory, but what about in practice? To answer that question, we needed more insight into the key components of any case hearing: the prosecution and the defense.
The prosecution is the legal party responsible for presenting the case against the individual accused of breaking the law, often representing the victim, law enforcement, and the government. The prosecutor works for the federal, state, county, and city governments. Private prosecutors do exist, but are typically seen in civil suits, not criminal trials. The prosecutor is the one who decides whether or what to charge, the one who sets the plea, the one who recommends the sentencing, the one who calls experts for testimony, and family for impact statements. The prosecutor also works closely with detectives and police departments to gain access to the necessary evidence and information to get their conviction.
The defense is the legal party responsible for convincing the jury that the prosecution has failed to meet their burden of proof. In other words, they need to convince the jury that their client is innocent. The defense is either public, meaning they work for the government, are assigned to cases fairly randomly, and are extremely busy and underpaid. Or the defense is private, meaning they are selected intentionally and are hired by the defendant, work for a firm of their own office, and are much better paid and much less busy. The defense meets with the client, reviews evidence, interviews experts and witnesses, and negotiates with the prosecution. The end goal of the defense is to reduce the charges against their client as much as possible.
Okay, so now we know what the prosecutor and defense do, but it's still not enough to answer our question from earlier. Could the options available for the defense actually succeed? We needed to know more, not just the roles of the prosecution and the defense, not just how they work, but how they think.
We sat down and interviewed two men in the field of law to get some different opinions. First up is Rhett Bergmark, a prosecutor who, for nearly 20 years, represented people diagnosed with mesothelioma and sued the pants off of big corporations, and, as of today, works for the Barnes firm. Yes, the one with the catchy jingle, you've probably heard it before on the radio and then switched the station.
Next is Kevin Chuckle, my cousin, who recently graduated from University of Georgia with a degree in political science. He spent the last year working at a prosecutor's office and will spend the next 3 in law school to become a prosecutor himself. For organization's sake, you'll hear the question asked, then Rhett's response, then Kevin's response. Oh, and apologies ahead of time. I interviewed Kevin during a family gathering, while my sisters were watching Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, and my mother and grandmother were spilling all the tea. So be warned, there is a fair bit of background noise during parts of our conversation.
Why did you want to become a prosecutor?
Well, I handle cases in the civil context now, and that's considered prosecution because I take on cases on behalf of plaintiffs, those people that are injured. And so that is a prosecutorial role because in taking on a civil case, you're finding fault with the person that caused the harm or the entity if it's a corporation or company. Or agency if it's a state. In the criminal context, I've worked on both sides. I've interned for the district attorney's office when I was an undergrad in college and attended arraignments, which is the very first stage of a criminal prosecution, and made sure that the charging papers were in order and that the facts met up with what we were intending to charge the defendant with. I've also been part of a public defender's office as well as a defense attorney in private practice in the criminal context. And I've enjoyed both sides equally. But in terms of my civil practice, I like helping people overcome the unfortunate circumstances that cause their injury and pain. And so I try and help people regain some normalcy.
The difference, in my opinion, between the appeal of being a prosecutor and the appeal of being a defense attorney is that as a defense attorney, you don't really get a win. The best you can hope for is basically a plea to get reduced charges. And that's not really a win. I mean, I didn't do as bad as I could have done. As long as you're surrounded by ethical people and allowed to act on your own volition, I think it's way more appealing to be a prosecutor just because you can, one, impact a greater number of people's lives positively by convicting people who deserve to be punished, but then also choosing not to punish the people who don't deserve to be punished.
How does the judicial system differ from what is shown through entertainment, such as television shows and podcasts?
The wheels of justice move much slower than it might seem on the big screen or the small screen, whether it's movies or television. It seems like cases just roll right through and you get all of the drama of the questioning and interrogation of a witness on the stand, and you don't really see any of the prelude to a trial. You don't see the work on what's called motions in limine, where you're trying to convince a judge through briefing, which is a submission of arguments in writing and orally, to a judge saying why certain evidence should come in or should not come in. And basically, it's like moving your pawns forward on a chessboard, making sure that you're in the best position for your bigger pieces, that being the evidence that you introduce and so forth, from being able to move forward in a manner you want to. You don't see a lot of the paperwork that's involved, and cases take a long time to generate. It takes a long time to bring a case to trial. Certain circumstances may speed it along, but I'd say that's the biggest difference, is that it is a slower process than people might think.
All most people know about like court stuff is what they see like on TV.
Yeah,
like
that's all totally wrong. When you're in court, one, you're not yelling at the jury. Like no one is yelling at witnesses because that looks really bad.
Yeah.
Your mannerism is really important. Mm-hmm. And when you see things on TV like, I object and stuff, like he did that and everyone in the courtroom was like, wow, what an asshole. Most of the time you're filing papers, issuing subpoenas, you're preparing your case for trial. Most of the time it doesn't even make it to trial. I mean, that's like 5% of cases in the U.S. as a total. And when you go to trial, it's very cordial, you present the facts. It's not overly emotional. You're not there to be overly emotional. The appeal is for the emotional part.
Yeah.
The initial trial by jury is purely for finding facts.
What do you think the faults of today's justice system are, and who's to blame for its failings?
I think one of the major problems is corporate lobbyists. The corporations will spend a lot of money, and that would include insurance companies, to make sure that people who are injured do not have an opportunity to get the full value of the judgments that they should receive. There are certain statutes that are created that will limit the recovery of a plaintiff, whether it's medical malpractice in what's called tort reform, or limiting the way a claim needs to be brought by a certain plaintiff, basically making major obstacles for the plaintiff to get their day in court.
There's a lot of faults. And who's to blame for that? And that's a tricky issue too, because a lot of them are necessary. A lot of people point to the practice of plea bargaining, but in a way it's necessary. I mean, we literally can't dispose of cases fast enough, so your options are either take a plea or have everyone sit in jail for 3 times as long. I think the cooperation with the police from the prosecutor side, I think that is a really big issue, in that it's one of the reasons you don't see police officers convicted very much. They work very closely with the prosecutor, and if you convict a police officer, you're basically indicting the entire department, and it turns them against you. You can't win as many cases. They don't bother collecting evidence if they know that you're going to be the one on the case, and they basically undermine you. I do think the practice of pegging prosecutor performance to the number of cases that they resolve in a manner that's beneficial to the government is a really bad system. I think it offers a really perverse incentive for bad plea bargains. It's really unethical in a lot of ways to make people try to convict people they don't really want to, especially by unethical AGs and SGs and DAs who maybe want those higher conviction numbers because it's pegged to their re-election chance. It's very much a practical system in that a higher conviction rate equals a bigger presumption of justice. We figure the more cases that get dissolved, the more justice is dispensed, and that's really not the case because a lot of them are dispensed in an unjust manner. I don't know there's anyone necessarily to fault for that other than us being human. We crave efficiency, but we also maintain this idea of we're better than animals, that we hold this special place of morality and ethicality that really is kind of self-inflated. It's a product of us thinking that we can apply really a concept of justice when we don't really know what that is. But it's just that we're focused on the wrong things, really.
Do you believe a jury's skepticism corrupts the presumption of innocence, thus inhibiting justice?
Well, there is a aspect of a trial that begins after the motions in limine that I spoke about earlier, where you have the court rule upon certain matters ahead of time, kind of stating what the rules are going forward in the trial. The very next step is what's called voir dire. And what voir dire is where both sides have an opportunity to pose questions to their prospective jurors and find out what biases those jurors might have in advance and exclude them for cause, meaning that there's no way that this juror will be able to be fair in considering the presumption of innocence of an individual.
The presumption of innocence, in my opinion, is kind of a myth. I mean, when someone is having charges brought against them, you assume there's a good reason for that. Because in most cases, why would they bother if there wasn't any evidence behind it? I mean, have you ever looked at someone and said, like, in the news that, allegedly committed a crime and was like, oh yeah, that person definitely didn't do it.
Right? So I get it.
It doesn't happen. And I think the fact that they're already skeptical of the defendant and he's in a losing position to start with, he doesn't really have the presumption of innocence, and it's up to the defense to mount a defense to overcome that. They're not using a standard of reasonable doubt. They're using a standard of overcoming my presumptions. A lot of the times the jury, from what I've seen, will, even if they believe that someone did something, they'll look for an excuse to say, we shouldn't do this. They tend to take people's lives pretty seriously, but they also take their duty to uphold the law very seriously. It instills with people some sort of, responsibility, to uphold justice as they see it. We assume people are guilty and then look for the facts to point otherwise.
Let's summarize. What have we learned so far? First, DNA evidence could be key in exonerating Adnan, but only if police can gather enough viable DNA to test for other suspects. Second, Adnan's only hope to push his case forward is to appeal to the state Supreme Court, and potentially the Supreme Court of the United States. Unfortunately, there's no certainty as to whether either of these courts will decide to hear his case. And third, regardless of any new DNA evidence, regardless of whether or not Adnan gets a new trial, the odds of success stand stacked high against him. With not only the courts, but the entire nation torn over whether Adnan Syed is innocent, there is nothing for us to do now but wait. This podcast was written, edited, and produced by Julia Kovac, Maddie Rovira, Bliss Bergmark, and Brooke Pierce. The music is the original score and music of Serial with an S podcast, written and mixed by Nick Thorburn and Mark H. Phillips. Special thanks to Mrs. Wolf and Maddie's friend Marcus for lending their voices to our intro, to Third Period Social Justice for participating in interviews, and to our special guests, Mr. Weaver, Miss White, Mr. Shuckle, and Mr. Bergmark. That's right, Bergmark, as in Bliss Bergmark. Next time on Serial.